So our team is very diverse. We're 50% women, and all of us came from non-traditional careers and transitioned into engineering. This is pretty common for data science type jobs like ours, but I challenge you to guess which of the women are in which of the roles. Product hacker was actually a role that originated at Brightroll, which was an advertising startup that made their mark on video ads a few years back, and they did an enormous amount of traffic. So when I joined a year and a half ago, they'd already been acquired by Yahoo, and at that time we were doing about 40 billion ad requests a day. We're now up to about 70 billion. So that means it's really big data, like actually big data. And for those of you who aren't familiar with advertising, I was not when I got this job. I've got a little stick figure person here on the side who's loading a web page. And what happens when your web page loads is there are many different slots that may become a display ad or a video ad. And what's happening in the background is a publisher is bidding on you, the user, in a little mini auction that has to take place in 100 milliseconds. So they send in their bids, we run the auction on the exchange, all these little demand side people bid on you, and then whoever wins gets to show their ad. Obviously, it doesn't always work perfectly. Sometimes there's a problem with an ad, and then we need to fall back to the next ad. Sometimes we have to load a whole bunch of them because there's problems with a bunch of ads. So there's a lot of moving parts. It has to happen quickly on a lot of data, so you can imagine there's a need for a lot of data science in a system like this. And then Brightroll got acquired by Yahoo. I joined when it was already Yahoo 6 months ago, actually more than that now, 8 months ago, we got acquired by Verizon. So now we're called Oath, which means we've merged with AOL, which means I'll tell you stories about both the Brightroll Yahoo side and the AOL side. It's been a really interesting journey. And Baron had inspired me to add an extra slide here to talk about why you need people like us to help you figure out what to measure and what those measurements mean. So typically we do an awful lot of translation between product and engineering, right? So they might say to us, we're losing money. And what they actually want to know is, what's broken, right? Like they don't want to go look at the code. They need someone who can go and do that for them. And when you're dealing with really big data, you might run a unit test where you send one little nice ad request from your little terminal, and you get back the right response, and you think everything's working great. But then you go and look at the statistics and you find out, actually, it's failing 5 or 10 or 20% of the time. But you wouldn't see that until you're running at scale. So you need to actually go in and look at the data in order to find that out. So that's the biggest part of our job, actually. But we also get a lot of spurious questions where people will say, something's broken. Like this example I have here, where periodically someone will come to us and they're looking at the wrong dashboard the wrong way, or a metric is poorly defined, and we have to say to them, actually, we've checked, everything's fine. You can calm down, go back about your regular business. So a big part of our job is also to help triage these kinds of things where there might be a business question that isn't actually a technical problem. But our main skill is really in generating and testing hypotheses to help troubleshoot business questions, and then figuring out how to communicate back fairly technical answers about statistics or machine learning to a less technical audience. So I'll tell you a little bit about our main 2 roles. One is troubleshooting existing features, which in my case has mostly been dealing with legacy code, and also prototyping new features and helping to test things that are relatively new, maybe, and see if they're working correctly. We actually do our own data engineering, so we don't have to pull from production databases, but also because that way we can build those wide tables like Baron was talking about, where we can pull together all the business metrics along with all the technical metrics. So we might pull in from different event-level data pipelines, but we actually build our own. And we have our own Airflow cluster, we run our own Spark jobs, we have our own Redshift cluster, and we push up to Looker, mostly because, personally, I hate sharing spreadsheets. I don't want to have to keep updating spreadsheets. It's much nicer if I can point someone at a Looker dashboard and let them play with it themselves. We do a lot of sampling, we do a lot of code, but a big part of our job is to circle back all the time with product and business and say, are we on the right track here? Does this make sense? What is the expected behavior here? So on the Brightroll side, I did some work with user matching last year, where we noticed that revenue was dropping. At the time, we weren't sure what was broken. It turned out multiple things were broken. But one of the things that stood out had to do with user matching. And part of why we didn't notice there was a problem was because there was limited logging on that part of the system, because it had to work really fast. And so they had sort of split the difference by saying, well, we'll have Grafana, and we'll just have to remember to check Grafana periodically. But in that case, it turned out it was just a configuration problem. But the only readout we had was the revenue. On the AOL side, it was way the other end of the spectrum. They didn't even have any metrics, like, at all. So I ended up having to parse their access logs from scratch. Nobody had ever used these logs for anything before. And in the process, I identified a whole bunch of problems and said, well, I don't know if these are causing the issues, but we should probably fix them. That's been an interesting experience. So here are some take-home messages. You guys probably already all know these things, but it's surprising how many people don't necessarily want to stick to these practices, because they are really laborious and tedious and annoying. But you have to go back and keep your data dictionaries up to date. The biggest thing I spend my time on is going back and forth between product and engineering. What field am I supposed to be looking at? What does this mean? How come it's empty? This is totally stale. Why are all these values null? That sort of stuff. But also things like just have a unique ID. Pick one. Stick with it. I know it takes up space. I know people worry, oh, we're spending money to store these values in the database and whatever, but trust me, it's worth it. Especially if you want to join across multiple data sources, it's really critical. One of the things that's kind of strange in advertising is that historically, the supply side of the business, totally separate from the demand side of the business. So if you actually wanted to do what Brightroll had been doing, which was to reconstruct the auction and have a single line for every auction, it's actually really hard to do unless you have an auction ID or something you can join on, where you can actually say, this was the input and this was the output. And I'm doing the same thing that Barron was saying. So this is the input, that's the output. Anyway. But things like timestamps, if your timestamps are missing and you want to aggregate over time windows, you're going to have problems. But it's amazing how many people, again, if you don't look at your logs, you wouldn't know that sometimes your timestamps are missing. And you might not know why. And one of the reasons we were having this problem is that their systems were sending events separately. So we have these beacon servers, they send some events to this database, they send some events to the ad server, they send some things to logging. They were not all in sync. So if things didn't arrive in the logs, we had missing data in the logs. And then we couldn't track back what had actually happened, because the logs aren't telling you what your events actually are. So, things like that, and then you might even end up with duplicates if you have the thing set up to just resend if it fails or whatever. How do you tell what's a real duplicate versus not if you don't have a timestamp or a unique ID? These things get really difficult really fast. Another thing we worked on had to do with infrastructure overload, and this has been a real success story for us. When I joined Brightroll, we had more ad requests than we could process. So tons and tons of stuff was coming in and just falling on the floor because our infrastructure could not handle all of it. So not only did that mean we couldn't process all of our input, but it also meant that our demand partners couldn't process all of it. So then they weren't able to bid on the stuff that they wanted. So everybody was losing money and wasting resources, basically. So, I went in and did some really basic analysis to start with. Should we just shut off some of these supply sources? If you're a business person, you might just think, oh yeah, those ad networks, they're crap. We'll just shut them all off. But if you actually go and look at the data, everybody has some good stuff and some crappy stuff. So it doesn't make sense to do it that way. So we went in and did a series of experiments where we were able to actually just say, like, okay, we'll try global random throttling. What happens if we do it that way? What if we do it by region? What if we do it by this metric or that metric? And how granular do we need to get? So, at the end of the day, one of our clever metrics, which was a derived revenue per million auctions type solution, ended up not working very well because it was a derived metric. So it was actually cutting out valuable supply because it was an average, right? And it turned out it worked better to just look at the supply sources that were sending us the vast majority of requests that had zero revenue. It was really that simple. It's actually very easy to identify the worst of the worst, right? So we took that approach and we're able to build a really simple machine learning model that can actually run fast enough to be deployed in production in our super fast system. But the reason we're able to do this stuff was that we can start all the way up at the top at Looker and look at, okay, what's our gross, what's our revenue, what do we need to filter, what do we know about the business side that can tell us what's likely to matter and what's not. We had questions about, who is spamming us, right? We know our Yahoo supply really well. We know what the quality metrics are on that. We have all these third-party publishers that we work with. Have we looked at those as carefully? Probably not. So we needed to go back and figure out what metrics are helping us there to figure out what's actually valuable. And, all of the obvious things with logging, right? Do we have a way to check whether something's in an A/B test and which test it's in? Really simple things like, can we add a flag for whether something is being filtered and why, and whether it's on a blacklist because of an IP address or a user ID that we think is spam or a bot or something, versus we think this is not making us money, because those are very different kinds of blacklists, right? So it's mostly just ruthless common sense, but being able to, as Baron was saying, prioritize and get these features built, and convince the less technical people that yes, it's worth the time to go back and fix the logging or to fix the unit tests or whatever. Let us run an A/B test. And I've relied a lot on Airflow for this because we have such big data. So we do pull in samples of data daily. And that means anytime anything breaks, we can go in and just look. Did anything change? Because you might not see it at the top level, business metric level, right? But because we can go into Redshift and all of our data is stuff that we've controlled and we've cleaned it and we know what the null values are and all that stuff, we can operate it on a lot faster. It just means that we have a lot more flexibility and we can get in there and do the data science part a lot sooner. And I've been relying on Spark most recently just because, again, we want maintainability. Previously, the data science teams were mostly using Pig, which to me is kind of unreadable. Worse than that, it's kind of unmaintainable. What we were finding was that only the person who had written the Pig job knew what it actually did and could fix it if it broke. Whereas, Spark, we're using PySpark, it's just Python. So we have unit tests for everything. It makes it a lot easier. And like I said, I personally hate spreadsheets. Looker has its pros and cons. I think whatever dashboarding tool that you use, it's worth it. Because at least to me, to spend time trying to update a spreadsheet and email it around, first of all, nobody reads their email, especially attachments. But second of all, you've got all these different versions floating around and nobody knows which version to look at. Whereas if you have a central dashboard, everybody can go and be on literally the same page about the version of the data that they're looking at. And I will stop there. I've worked with a lot of different people in my time at Yahoo and Oath. It's been a really interesting experience. Lots of people working interdisciplinary, collaboratively. It's been great. So I'll take questions if anybody has them. Thank you. So again, Brightroll was new at Yahoo, and they brought the video ad part. So integrating all of that together, we needed to add some new things that Yahoo didn't have. I haven't actually worked much with the Yahoo side, on the display side. They had really, really wide tables, like hundreds of different columns. Brightroll was kind of smaller in that sense. But there are different things you need for videos, like completion rates, right? Like you started playing the video, did you make it 25%, 50%, 100% of the way through? Was the ad playing pre-roll or mid-roll, before the video or in the middle of the video? Do we have a creative scoring system for how well did the video play and why did it fail? Did we put the wrong player on the wrong browser? Did we just get a bug or a lack of a response, or there's any number of things that can go wrong. The size of the player might be a mismatch. They might have lied to us, right? You're relying a lot on these open RTB specs and assuming that what they give you in their ad request is the right metrics for the video. So there's a lot of those things where we need to have a way of checking, did they send us the actual metrics that actually go with this video? And frequently they don't, or they're just wrong for some reason. So yeah, so we did have to build a lot of that ourselves for introspecting on a slightly more complicated system than just a display ad system. We kind of all do some of everything. We do have people who are a little bit stronger on the SQL and maybe less experienced with the engineering, and then we have an equal number of people who are maybe the other way around. But yeah, we have sort of an agile approach in the sense that, in theory, anyone could take any project from beginning to end, right, and go get their hands dirty in the logs, query the database, make a nice presentation for product or whatever, and do all of those things. So yeah, so what we try to do is share out those emergency calls. So if we get what they call an escalation, right, we're losing money, we don't know why kind of event, then we take turns taking that kind of thing, because it might be a lot more hands-on time, and you basically have to drop everything else you're doing to deal with that kind of business critical sort of thing. Versus say, okay, I'm going to refactor airflow and add unit tests. That's going to take me all quarter. I'm going to spend 75% of my time on that and 25% of my time on training another person on the team or whatever. So yeah, I mean, it's been a really great experience in the sense that we are very collaborative that way, and we want everybody to get some experience with all different parts of the business. Great, thanks.